Hey, what's up everybody? This is Osterberg501 and today I want to go over all of the information we have on itemization in Diablo 4. Now, itemization is one of the most important parts of Diablo 4 for a lot of players, and if it's implemented poorly, that would put a lot of players off from playing the game because it would have such a fundamental issue. So I wanted to go over a good overview so people can understand itemization and gearing a little bit better. And also, there are a lot of systems tied into this, and I don't want people to have to go watch 5 other videos to understand all of these systems. So this video is going to be a little bit longer than I normally do. There will be timestamps so you can skip around to watch whatever portion you want, but this will allow me to give a really good overview of everything without leaving anything major out. Now, I think a good place to start would be the actual rarity of items, because these have actually changed a few times throughout the quarterly updates. And where they have landed is they're going to have normal items, which are white, magic items, which are blue, rare items, which are yellow, legendary and set items, which are both being considered in the same tier, legendary items being more of a dark orange or red color, set items being green, and then unique items, which are more of a light orange color. And a lot of these rarities are going to work quite a bit differently than other Diablo games. And the first big change of the system is the actual stat weights on singular affixes on items. The basis of this system being the lower rarity an item is, the less amount of different affixes can roll on that item, but the more stats a single affix can have. So they give an example here. They have a magic or a blue item that has one affix, which has a 16.8% immobilization chance. Then they have a rare or yellow quality item that also has an immobilized chance on it, but this has 11% immobilized chance. So quite a bit less on that one affix than what you could get on a magic item, but rare items can roll with more affixes on them. The specific one having 3 affixes and also 1 more socket than the magic item had. Then once you go up to legendary items, this one has a 9% immobilization chance. So even lower than the rare item could have. But this legendary item also has 4 affixes and its legendary effect. Now, in theory, what this could accomplish is that there might be situations where certain builds actually could potentially be using a magic item, or maybe multiple magic items, because if these magic items can roll much higher in a singular stat, and if there's a build someone creates that just wants one stat incredibly high, you could potentially want magic items thrown into that build, which will allow you to get one stat much higher than all the others. Now, this brings us to the new legendary system on legendary items, because the legendaries are going to work quite a bit differently than they ever have in other Diablo games. So essentially, once you get a legendary items will have 4 affixes and their 1 legendary power. Now, these legendary powers can actually randomly roll on a handful of different items. So say this specific legendary power could roll on one-handed weapons, two-handed weapons, gloves, amulets, and rings, just for an example. So it's not always going to be on just one item, giving you more variation on where you can put your different legendary powers. But what comes with this is a new NPC, the Occultist, which allows you to pull off that legendary power off of that item, which will destroy that item, but it gives you a new item, which is the essence of that legendary power, which is a new item that can be stored and saved for later, or you can put this essence on another item that it's allowed to be put on. So the example they give is a pent-up axe that has a legendary power on it. They pull the essence off of this axe, destroying it, and you get this pent-up glowing essence that has a legendary power on it, and this essence is allowed to be put on one-handed weapons, two-handed weapons, gloves, amulets, and rings. And also for two-handed weapons, the power is increased more, and on amulets, the power is also increased. So specific slots can also give you more benefit from the legendary than others. Now, with this essence, essence, you can put this on other legendary items, which will remove the legendary power on that current item, giving it the power of the essence, or you can put this essence on rare items. And this gives you the opportunity to get a best in slot item, because at a baseline, rare items can roll up to 5 affixes on them, but legendary items can only roll 4 affixes because the 5th slot is taken up by the legendary. So what you can actually do is get a legendary item, pull the essence off, and then put it on a rare item you have with 5 affixes on it, which will allow you to get a legendary item with 5 affixes on it and the legendary effect. Now, this also doesn't mean that you're going to get one legendary and you're always going to have that power now, because taking the essence off of an item destroys that item, and it seems like these essences won't be able to be taken off of an item once you place it into a new item. So it seems like you're able to take it off of an item once, put it in a new item once, and then you're done. You have to go get other legendaries if you want more essences of that specific legendary. But this also does mean that every legendary, or most legendaries, are at least going to have some amount of use, because you could take their essence off to make sure you have that essence. This is kind of like a middle ground between games where you unlock a legendary and you always have that power, and games where if you want that legendary, again, you just have to keep farming for it. Kind of a middle ground that gives you a bit more of deterministic gearing, because you can choose to put this essence on a well-rolled item. Now, as I mentioned when going over the rarities, legendary items are in the same tier as set items, but they have mentioned that they want legendary items themselves to be a little bit stronger than set items. Now, I think what they're trying to accomplish with this is making set items still be viable to be used in builds, because they're not going to be stronger as an item themselves, but you're going to get stronger via their set item bonus. They don't want a situation like in Diablo 3 where pretty much every single build is made up of 1 or 2 sets of items, and every build is basically required to use a certain set item, which allows for a lot more flexibility and build creation when set items aren't so incredibly strong that they're needed for every singular build. So hopefully we're going to be seeing builds where maybe they use only half of a set of items to get 1 bonus, some builds where they go full into a specific set and get all the bonuses, and then some builds that don't use any set items and are more focused on these more one-off legendaries. Now that brings us to the highest rarity of items, which are uniques. And uniques are going to be items that you can only equip 1 of at a time, so you can't have multiple uniques equipped at the same time, and they're all static rolls. So when you get this specific item, it's going to have the same roll on it. But a lot of these uniques are going to have incredibly strong build enabling effects on them. They give some examples, such as the Storm Walker's Cudgel, which when your hurricane deals damage, there's a chance to automatically cast Tornado at that target for free. And there's some other examples, but these are specifically being built as very strong effects that will completely enable a specific build, and that build won't work correctly if you don't have the unique item. So these are going to be very important, but the trade-off is also going to be that most likely a lot of these aren't going to be the best stats on them, and you're not going to be able to go and farm these more to get random rolls on them. They're all static rolls, so you kind of take that hit on the stats to get that one incredibly strong effect that's needed for the build you're working on. Now, statting on items is going to be pretty important, but first we have to go over what the main stats actually do in Diablo 4, because they work in a decently unique way, at least when looking at them between different classes. So at a baseline, a lot of your primary stats are going to come from leveling up, and also later on going to come from other progression systems such as your Paragon board or your class skill trees. But every time you level up, you gain 5 stat points. You also gain 2 skill points, but those won't primarily be just for increasing your stats. So with these 5 stat points, you can put them into either strength, intelligence, willpower, or dexterity. But all 4 of these stats do something different for every class. So for example, a barbarian gets increased skill damage and increased increased defense off of their strength, but a sorceress only gains increased defense off of strength. But then if you go to intelligence, the barbarian only gains increased resistances, but the sorceress gains increased skill damage and increased resistances. And this goes on for all the different stats. So essentially how this is working is every stat on every class gives a defensive buff at a baseline, but then certain stats that fit that class will give you an offensive bonus. So like I mentioned, increased skill damage for barbarians with strength and increased skill damage off intelligence for sorceresses. And these main stats are pretty simple to understand. The way they're doing it does give a little bit more variation, especially if you're someone that's going to be playing multiple different classes, and it will change up how you're gearing out your character when it comes to main stats quite a bit, because every stat is still useful in some way, but you may want to specialize in specific stats to also get a damage bonus off of them. And then multiple of the stats also give you different damage bonuses as well. So for example, you're getting that skill damage off of strength on a barbarian, but you're getting increased critical strike chance off of dexterity. So there's a potential that there's barbarian builds that maybe go full dexterity. But then if you go over to a sorceress, you're gaining increased resource generation off of dexterity instead of that crit chance. So a full dexterity sorceress would be completely different than a full dexterity barbarian, which could heavily aid in build creation. Now switching over to stats on items you're going to be picking up, there's actually another pretty beloved stat type that's going to be in Diablo 4 as well, and that is plus skill rank affixes. So the example they give is plus 4 ranks to flay on this magic act. Now plus skill ranks in Diablo 4 work a little bit differently than in some other games. So at a baseline, you get plus skill ranks on the skill you're using. It's going to make that skill more powerful. But another really interesting part of this affix is that if you get plus skill rank to a skill that you don't have learned, or that you may not even be able to learn yet, you actually unlock that skill to be able to be used. So not only are plus skill rank affixes usually pretty strong in games like this, giving you the potential to want to get a lot of that for your main skills, but also there's the potential that you don't use your skill points, which you get from leveling up and put in a big class tree. There's a potential that you don't want to use those to unlock a skill, but instead get plus skill ranks on an item that will unlock that skill that then you can put on your bar and use, especially if that skill is something that you don't really care to make stronger and you just need it at its base power. There's a potential you could just get a +1 rank to the skill you want, and you don't have to use other points going into it. And it would only take up potentially 1 out of 5 affix slots on a rare item. Now, like I mentioned, even though this video is focused on itemization, we still have to go over a lot of the progression systems because of how stats tie into these progression systems, which will influence a lot of the ways you're gearing up your character. And one of the big ways is hitting certain stat thresholds will unlock new effects. And this is actually in multiple different progression systems in the game. So first off, we have the class skill tree. Now we only have a pretty early work in progress version of the skill tree, but essentially how they're doing this is the top portion of the skill tree is what you put your skill points in for leveling up. And this will have your actual skill unlocks, it will have some passives, and it will have nodes that give you other passive points. Essentially, you put the skill point into a node, it'll give you some passive points, which you get to use on the bottom half of the skill tree. Now, the bottom half of the skill tree has a lot of passives that affect your abilities themselves. And a lot of these ability upgrades are what will have these additional bonuses for getting certain stat thresholds. An example they give is you have your Whirlwind ability unlock for the Barbarian. Unlocks Whirlwind, you know what a Whirlwind is. You spin around to deal damage, spin to win. Then you have a Whirlwind upgrade, which Whirlwind restores 1 Fury each time it hits an enemy. Now this isn't specified if it's at the top or the bottom. I assume this is at the top half of the tree. But then you have more Whirlwind upgrades, and these seem to be things that would be at the bottom half of the tree. So the first one is Whirlwind no longer slows the Barbarian's movement speed while active, but there is also a second second part to this. If you have 150 dexterity, Whirlwind will then provide 3% movement speed boost each second while active up to 15%. Now you can still get this upgrade and get the first half. If you also have 150 dexterity, you get the second part, which is also still a strong effect. And there's another one they show, which is another Whirlwind upgrade. At a baseline, you get 10% increased critical strike damage of Whirlwind. If you have 225 strength and dexterity, your Whirlwind provides 1% critical strike damage per second while active up to 20%, giving you a much stronger bonus effect than the original baseline effect of this upgrade actually is. And this will pretty heavily change how you want to be gearing your character, where you want to be putting your stat points. And also, you are able to get main stats off of a lot of your items. A lot of your main stats are going to come from just leveling up and getting those stat points, but you're still able to get a lot of main stats from items. I think one of the items I showed actually had like a 16% increased strength affix on it. So there's a potential for some of your items to very heavily increase your main stats. And that's not the only system in the game that gives you bonus effects for hitting certain stat thresholds. So that brings us to Paragon Boards. Now, a quick overview of Paragon Boards is that this is an endgame system you unlock at level 50, level 100 being max level. And after level 50, after you unlock the Paragon Boards, you will be getting around 4 Paragon points per level up to level 100. So that will mean you max out at 200 Paragon points. Paragon Boards are a big boards with a bunch of different nodes to spend points in, made up of common, magic, rare, and legendary tiles. Once you get to the edge of a board, it unlocks a gateway, and there will be a large selection of boards. So once you get to that gate, you can slot in another board, and also the new boards you slot in, you can also turn. Now, the basics of these boards is that a large chunk of the board is going to be made up of common tiles, which primarily will give you primary stat increases, so strength, dexterity, etc. And that's a primary way you're going to be moving throughout the board. Magic tiles are more utility or defensive buffs. The example they give is 10% fire resistance. Magic tiles are said to be in clusters and not everywhere throughout the board. Then every board will have one legendary power on it that's very, very strong, and that's usually put at the center of the board. So that will also pretty heavily dictate what boards you want to use. We skipped one, which are rare tiles. Now this is where getting certain amount of main stats comes into play, because there are a handful of rare tiles throughout every board, and rare tiles give you a base effect, but give you another effect if you have a certain amount of stats. The example they give is Hungering Fury, which grants 10 fury per kill, but if you have 175 strength and 125 willpower, you gain 8% increased fury. So that again ties stat weighting into your build and into itemization, because this will also go back to even the gear you're wearing. If you see some really strong bonus power on the Paragon board, you would want to utilize that, which could affect what gear you're actually going to be using. If you see a really strong rare Paragon effect and you don't have the stats, but then you pick up a new item that gives you a big stat boost to that stat, that may cause you to use that new item to specifically get that bonus effect on that Paragon tile. But then you also have to try to balance that with the other skill upgrades, where those also give you pretty strong bonus effects if you hit certain stats. So there's going to be a lot of picking and choosing, build creation, and optimization specifically around these main stats, which can dictate what gear and stats you're looking for on items. So that brings us to another item that's going to be tying into your main stats and other effects, and is also an item that you're going to be searching for out in the world, just like other gear pieces, and these are called glyphs. So glyphs are also used on Paragon boards. Now, throughout all the different Paragon boards, there's going to be a handful of sockets. Now, sockets are essentially empty Paragon tiles that allows you to slot a glyph into them, and that will not only give you just benefits from this glyph, these glyphs also have a radius which will affect all other tiles in a certain radius around them. Now they give some examples of some of these glyphs. So first off, we have a rare glyph called Empower. It's at level 3 and its radius size is small. So this is going to affect tiles in a smaller radius. And this grants a 30% bonus to all nodes within range, which is massive. Now keep in mind that the majority of tiles on Paragon boards are the common ones, which just give you main stat increases, which would mean if you just put this into a socket and got all of the main stat increases around this socket, that could potentially give you a pretty big boost in certain main stats you're looking for, which again would tie into ability upgrades, would tie into what gear you want to use, because if you get more stats from Paragon boards, you may be able to look for non-main stat affixes on your armor pieces. Then that also ties into other Paragon board powers, which will just heavily affect how you're creating your build. Then the second glyph is called Exploit, and it's a rare glyph, level 8. Radius size is medium, so affects a larger amount of tiles than the first glyph we went over. For every 10 dexterity purchased within range, you deal 13.5% increased damage to vulnerable targets. And it also gives a 40.5% bonus to all nodes within range. So the higher rarity of glyph also gives you additional affixes on it that will affect more things within the range of it. So now you're slotting in this glyph, and for every 10 dexterity you're getting in this glyph's range, you're now doing more damage to vulnerable targets. So if you have a dexterity build, you're going to want to get as many dexterity nodes in range of this as you can, which is also going to give them bonuses because this glyph increases the amount of stats you're getting from all those tiles in range. Then finally, there's a level 15 rare glyph called Conquer. Radius size is large, so this affects even more tiles, and for every 10 willpower purchased within range, you deal 31% increase overpower damage, and this grants 4 strength for each willpower purchased within range. So now this also is very interesting. So instead of giving you a bonus to the stats you're already getting, it's now giving you strength for every point of willpower you're getting within range. And then it's synergizing with the glyph itself because you're getting more overpower damage for all willpower you get in this area. So this glyph specifically could potentially be really good for a build that has both strength and willpower in it, which again can tie heavily back into what stats you're looking for on items, for activating bonus effects on your skill upgrades, and for activating the bonus effects on other Paragon board tiles. So that brings us to the final piece of information we have on itemization, which is weapons. Now, all the different types of weapons in Diablo 4 are going to have pretty significant differences in how they work. Not only will there be differences in attack speeds for 1 to 2-handed weapons, for instance, a 2-handed staff and a wand will have different channel times on certain spells, but every weapon also has a specific weapon affix that will be the same across that weapon type. So for example, a rare wand is a very fast weapon, and that will be something that it actually shows on the weapon tooltip, and all wands give it some amount of increased critical strike chance. So this rare wand here has 850 attack, very fast weapon, 3% critical strike chance, and this is the weapon specific stats. This has nothing to do with the randomly rolled affixes on them. But then they also show another magic wand, which again is a very fast weapon. This one only has 299 attack, but has 4% increased critical strike chance, because all wands will have that increased critical strike chance. For some other weapons, you have axes, which have a 30% chance to inflict bleed for 30% damage over 5 seconds. Then you have staffs, which are slow weapons, which gives you increased resource regeneration. So not only are you going to be looking for all the different affixes and effects on different items, but even the weapon type is going to be important when creating your build. And this also ties pretty heavily into the new legendary system. Because for example, say there's a legendary effect that is incredibly strong for your build, one of the main things you need for your build. And say you get that effect on a staff. Your build really doesn't need more resource regeneration. But say you're able to take that legendary effect off of that staff and put it on a magic wand. So now your magic wand has a legendary effect you got off the staff. You're now getting the increased critical strike chance which comes on every wand, instead of the resource regeneration that comes on every staff. So the weapons having specific stats that come on all those weapon types tied in with the new legendary system gives you quite a lot of variation and options when crafting your build. Now, one last thing I want to go over is we do have a little bit of information on different ways you're able to hunt specific items, or at least specific item types. Some of this information being that different monster families or different factions in the games will like to collect different item types. So specifically, bandits will be fond of maces, crossbows, and boots. But if you're hunting a new pair of pants, you may want to go kill Drowned instead. So certain factions, certain enemy types will have a higher chance to give you certain item types and certain gear slots more than they'll give you other slots. Now, we don't know how much of a difference this is actually going to make, but since they're detailing it in one of the quarterly updates, this is probably something that is going to actually be noticeable, meaning that you have a little bit more deterministic gearing by going and hunting specific enemy type. Now, to add on to that, we do know that there's going to be a little bit of this in the dungeons in the game as well. And the main mention of this is that they mentioned that, say, one dungeon will have a higher chance to drop helms. Now, we don't know how this is going to expand throughout all the different dungeons. Are there going to be like 30 dungeons that all have increased chance to give helms? Or is one dungeon going to have a higher chance to give a certain set helmet? Or are the nightmare keys for these dungeons also going to have some augment that gives them a higher chance to drop legs or something? And we also don't know how this is going to interact with the base different factions and monsters that we went over. So if you go in a dungeon that says it has a higher chance to drop helms, and then there are a bunch of bandits in there because of the kind of randomized enemy pool, how is that going to work since bandits drop more maces, crossbows, and boots, but the dungeon drops more helms? Is it going to mean the dungeon overrides that effect and you get a lot more helms, or are the bandits going to override that loot? So not sure on that, but they are definitely planning on a bunch of different ways for you to add a little bit more deterministic gearing and looting into the game. So that is pretty much all the information we have on itemization for Diablo 4. And my thoughts on the general way they're going about this is that currently right now, with all the information we have, it does seem like we are going to have a lot more in-depth way of creating builds and general itemization than we had in Diablo 3, and I think even surpassing Diablo 2 in some ways, because of how they're tying in main stats into so many of the progression systems in the game, and how they're giving so much variation in just the different items and their rarities, giving different stat weights depending on the rarity, giving different amounts of affixes. I think that the game is going to be pretty in-depth and have a lot of potential builds and build creation. So subscribe if you want to see more Diablo 4 or other videos. Leave a like if you liked the video. Leave a comment down below what you guys think about the itemization in Diablo 4, and thanks for watching.